Hello. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Edward, 34 years old, a general internist working at a small clinic in the suburbs of Chicago. My life revolves around long days at the clinic, where the smell of antiseptic mingles with the murmurs of patients in the waiting room. I'm not the type who lives in a mansion or owns a multi-million-dollar fortune like characters in novels. I'm just an ordinary doctor with a salary sufficient to live comfortably, pay the mortgage on my 2-bedroom apartment, and send a regular sum to my parents each month. But if I had to say what keeps me up at night, it's not the complex medical cases. It's my family, or rather the persistent injustices I've endured in the very home where I grew up. My clinic is located on a quiet street, lined with maple trees that blaze red every autumn. Each day I start at 7 a.m., reviewing patient files, listening to stories of pain, anxiety, and sometimes secrets they dare not share with anyone else. I love this job not only because it gives me purpose, but also because it helps me temporarily forget the troubles at home. But today, as the first rays of sunlight slipped through my office window, I received my father's test results. One number made my heart clench. His blood creatinine levels were abnormally high. As a doctor, I know what that means. Kidney failure is a real risk. I sat there clutching the paper, trying to stay calm. I haven't told my parents yet. I'm not ready to face them, especially when everything at home is already a tangled mess. My family, how should I put it, is like an old book with every page torn and frayed. My parents live about an hour's drive from Chicago in a 2-story suburban house they bought back in the 80s. My father, Henry, a retired bank employee, now spends his days in an armchair reading newspapers and recounting stories from his youth. My mother, Margaret, is the kind of person who's always busy, from tending her flower garden to cooking meals she believes will bring the family together. But the one who truly disrupts everything is my younger brother, Eric. At 30, Eric still lives like an overgrown teenager. No stable job, no plans, and always in trouble. From credit card debts to losing bets, Eric seems to have a knack for turning everything into a disaster. And what infuriates me the most? My parents always take his side. Growing up, I was used to making way for Eric. As the eldest, everything I did had to set an example. When I got high grades in school, my parents gave me a cursory pat on the back, but if Eric passed an exam, they threw a party. When I graduated from medical school, they sent a congratulatory text. But when Eric opened a coffee shop, only to go bankrupt 6 months later, they poured their savings into bailing him out. I'm not one to keep score, but the unfairness has built up like a smoldering wound that never heals. Every month I send my parents about $2,000 to help cover their expenses. I do it not for gratitude, but because I know they need it. Yet I can't help but feel angry when I learn that much of that money ends up in Eric's pocket. He borrows from them to pay off debts only to rack up new ones. And my parents, instead of holding him accountable, turn to me saying I must help my brother because family comes first. I've heard that phrase so many times it's become a mantra, both familiar and exhausting. Today, sitting in my office, I couldn't stop thinking about my father's test results. He visited my clinic 2 days ago for his annual checkup. Every time he comes, I examine him thoroughly, blood pressure, heart rate, and when the results come back stable, I feel a weight lift off my shoulders. He usually sits in the exam chair telling stories about his banking days or joking about how my mother forces him to cut back on salt. But this time was different. He complained about frequent nighttime urination, waking up 3 or 4 times a night, and I noticed his face was slightly swollen, with mild puffiness in his hands and feet. I kept a calm demeanor, but inside I had a sinking feeling. I ordered additional blood and urine tests, requesting a detailed analysis, still hoping it was just a sign of aging. But today's results confirmed my fears. High creatinine, protein in the urine, and a host of other indicators all pointed to one thing. His kidneys were in serious trouble. I know I need to talk to my parents, but the thought of facing them fills me with dread. I'm afraid that if I bring it up, everything will somehow revolve around Eric again. That my parents will find a way to make it my responsibility as they always do. But I can't stay silent forever. I decided I'd visit them this weekend during the family dinner my mother has been talking about for a month. Little did I know that dinner would turn everything upside down. Saturday came faster than I expected. I drove through familiar roads, past sprawling cornfields and wooden shingled houses. My parents' home is the same as ever, with its faded white picket fence and a garden full of the chrysanthemums my mother loves. As I stepped inside, the smell of grilled meat and mashed potatoes wafted from the kitchen, pulling me back to simpler childhood days. But now, every time I enter this house, it feels like stepping into a battlefield where I'm always on guard. My mother greeted me with a hug, but I could see the tension in her eyes. My father was at the dining table, flipping through an old newspaper. Eric hadn't arrived yet, late, as usual. We sat down and my mother started talking about her garden, the neighbors, anything but what really mattered. I tried to find a way to bring up my father's test results, but every time I opened my mouth, my throat tightened. I knew I needed the right moment, but that moment never seemed to come. Then Eric showed up, his hair a mess and a carefree grin on his face. He wore a crumpled t-shirt, looking like he'd just rolled out of an all-night party. "Sorry, big bro," he said, clapping me on the shoulder as if we were best buddies. I nodded, suppressing my irritation. Dinner began, and it was the usual routine. My mother fussed over Eric, my father laughed at his jokes, and I sat there, feeling like an outsider in my own family. But then, mid-meal, my father dropped a bombshell. "Edward, we need to talk about something important," he said, his voice low. I thought he was about to mention his health, that maybe he knew something was wrong. But no, he continued. "Your mother and I have decided to remortgage the house. Eric needs money to pay off his debts, and we want to help him start over." I felt the blood rush to my head. The house, the only asset my parents have, the one they spent their lives paying off, was now going to be risked for Eric yet again. I looked at Eric. He stared at the table, but I knew he felt no remorse. I looked at my mother. She avoided my gaze. And I looked at my father. The man I'd just learned was carrying a dangerous illness, yet was willing to sacrifice everything for his perpetually wayward son. "I don't agree," I said, my voice icy. The table fell silent. My mother looked at me, shocked. "Edward, how can you say that? Eric is your brother. You have to help him." There it was again, that same old line. Something inside me snapped. I stood up, pulled the test results from my pocket, and placed them in front of my father. "You need to know this before you decide anything," I said. "Your creatinine levels are dangerously high. You're at risk of kidney failure. That means dialysis or a transplant with costs in the hundreds of thousands. And I'm not paying another dime." The room froze. My mother covered her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. My father stared at the paper, his hands trembling. Eric, for once, said nothing. I went on, my voice shaking with anger and pain. "My whole life I've done everything for this family. I send money, I take care, I work myself to exhaustion. But all you see is Eric. From the time we were kids, you've told me to help him, to make way for him. Well, I'm done. Let Eric take care of you. Let Eric cover the costs of dialysis, a transplant, everything. I'm done." I turned and walked out, leaving a heavy silence behind. As I got into my car, my heart pounded with both rage and relief. For the first time, I'd said what had been festering inside me, but deep down, I know this story isn't over, and I fear that no matter how hard I try, I can't escape the ties that bind me to my family. I drove back to my apartment in the darkness, the faint streetlights streaking past the car window like scattered beams. The hum of the engine was steady, but my mind was a chaotic mess. The anger still simmered like glowing embers, but it was laced with an indescribable emptiness. The words I'd spoken at dinner, sharp, resolute, echoed in my head. I'd said I was done, that I wouldn't pay another cent, that I was leaving it to Eric to take care of our parents. But when the image of my father, his trembling hands clutching the test results, flashed before me, I couldn't stop a flicker of worry from creeping into my heart. As a doctor, I knew exactly what those numbers meant. As a son, I couldn't stop thinking about the worst possible outcome. My apartment is on the 5th floor of a building that's not exactly new but comfortable enough to call home. I opened the door, tossed my keys onto the kitchen counter, and collapsed onto the sofa. The glow from the streetlights filtered through the window, casting light on the plain white wall. I pulled out my phone and stared at the empty screen. No calls, no messages. My parents hadn't reached out, nor had Eric. Part of me felt relieved, but another part felt abandoned. I wondered if they truly understood what I'd said, or if they just saw it as a fleeting outburst. I closed my eyes, trying to push away the image of my mother covering her mouth, tears in her eyes, and my father, his face like he'd been struck by a blow. But I didn't regret it. Not yet. The days that followed passed in a familiar rhythm, but heavier. I worked at the clinic, saw patients, prescribed medications, and explained complex medical terms in the simplest way possible. But every time I looked at a patient's file, my thoughts drifted to my father. I wondered if he'd gone to the hospital for a follow-up, or if he was simply ignoring it, the way he and my mother always ignored Eric's problems. I wanted to call, to ask what they'd done, but every time I picked up the phone, I stopped myself. I'd said I was done, and I needed to stand by that. Then one morning, about a week after that fateful dinner, I was reviewing my appointment schedule when Sarah, the nurse at the front desk, knocked on my door. "Dr. Edward," she said, her voice hesitant, "your parents are in the waiting room. They want to see you." My heart sank. I didn't know how to face them, not after what I'd said. But I nodded and told Sarah to let them in. When my parents walked in, I barely recognized them. My mother looked older, her eyes shadowed with dark circles, her silver hair disheveled despite her usual care for her appearance. My father, already thin, looked even more frail, his shirt hanging loosely on his frame like it was draped over a skeleton. They sat down, and my mother spoke first. "Edward," she said, her voice trembling, "we need to get your father checked again. We're so worried." I looked at my father, noticing his attempt to stay calm, but his hands were clasped tightly, knuckles white. "Have you had any new symptoms?" I asked, trying to keep my tone professional, as if he were just another patient. He nodded, his voice hoarse. "Still urinating a lot at night, more tired, and I'm finding it hard to breathe, especially when I walk." I took notes, but inside I knew these signs weren't good. I recommended they see a nephrologist at a larger hospital with advanced equipment and specialized staff. "I'll arrange an appointment," I said, "but I can't do more than that here." My mother looked at me, her eyes pleading. "Edward, you'll come with us, won't you?" I wanted to say no, to remind them I'd handed this responsibility to Eric, but looking into her eyes, I just nodded. "I'll come." The hospital visit took place 2 days later. I drove my parents to Chicago Medical Center, where I knew a few colleagues. Dr. James Carter, a nephrologist I respected, personally examined my father. I sat in the waiting room with my mother while my father underwent tests, CT scans, ultrasounds, and another round of blood and urine analyses. My mother held my hand so tightly it hurt. "You're angry with us, aren't you?" she whispered. I didn't answer, just stared at the floor where the glossy white tiles reflected the fluorescent lights. After nearly 3 hours, Dr. Carter called us into his office. He was a tall man with a deep, calm voice, but today I saw the gravity in his eyes. "Mr. Henry," he began, looking directly at my father, "the results show you're in end-stage renal failure. Your kidneys are functioning at less than 10%. You need to start dialysis immediately or consider a kidney transplant if a suitable donor is found." My mother burst into tears, her sobs echoing in the small room. My father sat still, his gaze distant, as if trying to process every word. I, despite bracing myself, felt like I'd been punched in the chest. As a doctor, I knew what end-stage renal failure meant. Dialysis 3 times a week, 4 hours each session, costing tens of thousands of dollars a year. A transplant, if feasible, could cost up to $300,000, not including medications and post-surgery care. I looked at my father, the man who once carried me on his shoulders when I was a child, now looking smaller and more fragile than ever. "Does dialysis hurt, doctor?" my father asked, his voice weak. Carter explained, his tone gentle but unflinching. "It's not comfortable, but we'll do everything to make you as comfortable as possible. In the long term, a transplant is the better option, but it requires a compatible donor and significant costs." My mother clutched my father's hand, tears streaming down her cheeks. "We'll manage, Henry," she said, but her voice trembled as if she didn't believe her own words. As we left the hospital, no one spoke. I drove my parents home, the air in the car heavy as lead. My mother sat in the back, holding my father while I stared straight ahead, trying not to let my emotions take over. I knew they were panicking, knew they didn't have the money to cover what was coming. But I also knew deep down that I wasn't ready to forgive them. Not yet. That night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind swirling with numbers and images. The cost of dialysis, medications, and the possibility of a transplant, it was all a whirlwind. I thought of Eric, who was probably somewhere out there, maybe in a bar or a casino, not giving a thought to our father. I thought of my parents, who had spent their lives shielding Eric and were now facing the consequences of that favoritism. And I thought of myself, always doing the right thing, yet feeling trapped in an endless cycle of unfairness. My phone buzzed. It was a text from my mother. "Edward, can we talk? We need you." I stared at the screen, my finger hovering over the reply button, but then I stopped. I put the phone down, closed my eyes, and let the darkness swallow everything. The days following the hospital visit passed like a prolonged nightmare. I tried to return to my daily routine, mornings at the clinic, seeing patients, taking notes, prescribing medications, but every time I saw an elderly patient, I saw my father with his frail hands and distant gaze. His test results, end-stage renal failure, loomed over me like a shadow, no matter how hard I tried to push it out of my mind. I told myself I'd done enough, that I was right to set boundaries at that dinner. But every time my phone buzzed, every time I saw my mother's number on the screen, a storm of emotions surged within me, anger, guilt, and love all tangled together. My mother called 3 times since the hospital visit, leaving voicemails I hadn't dared to listen to. "Edward, please call me back," she said in one, her voice choked with emotion. "Your father isn't doing well. I don't know what to do." I wanted to respond, to say I wasn't the only one in this family, that Eric needed to take responsibility too. But every time I started to type a reply, I stopped, as if an invisible wall held me back. I was afraid that if I gave in, everything would revert to how it's always been. I'd be the one carrying the weight while Eric continued his carefree life. Then one Wednesday afternoon, as I was finishing a patient's chart, Sarah, the nurse at the front desk, knocked on my door. "Dr. Edward," she said softly, "your parents are here again. They don't look too good." I sighed, feeling the weight of the world on my shoulders. "Let them in," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, though my heart was pounding. The door opened and my mother walked in first, her eyes red and puffy, clutching a crumpled handkerchief. My father followed slowly, as if every step was an effort. He wore an old sweater, his shoulders hunched, and I noticed he'd lost even more weight since the hospital visit. They sat down across from my desk, and the room suddenly felt stifling despite the open window. I looked at them, waiting, but I already knew what was coming. "Edward," my mother began, her voice trembling, "I know you're angry with us. I know you think we've been unfair, but your father is very weak. The doctor said dialysis will cost a lot, and a transplant would be even more expensive. We don't have enough." She paused, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I'm begging you, Edward, please help us. You're a doctor, you know what to do. We can't lose your father." I looked at my father. He sat silently, his eyes fixed on the floor, as if ashamed to witness my mother pleading with me. I wanted to shout, to ask why they never demanded anything of Eric, why I was always the one who had to sacrifice. But seeing my father with his pale skin and shallow breaths, I felt a sharp pain in my chest. As a doctor, I knew he didn't have much time without proper treatment. As a son, I couldn't bear the thought of losing him, even though the family's unfairness still choked me. "Have you asked Eric?" I asked, my voice colder than I intended. My mother blinked as if my question was a slap. "Eric, he can't help, you know that," she said, almost whispering. "He's trying to find a job, but he has no money. You're the only one we can rely on, Edward." I let out a dry laugh, a harsh sound escaping my throat. "So once again, I'm the one who has to fix everything? Do you know how much money I've sent you over the years, Mom? Tens of thousands of dollars, and where did most of it go? To Eric's debts, his failed ventures? Now Dad's sick and I'm still the one who has to step up?" My mother burst into tears, her head bowed, her shoulders shaking. My father finally spoke, his voice weak but resolute. "Edward, you're right. We were wrong to indulge Eric so much, but you're the eldest, a doctor. I'm not asking you to forgive us, but I'm begging you. Don't let me die because of our mistakes." His words hit me like a knife. My eyes stung, but I clenched my jaw, refusing to let tears fall. I wanted to scream that I wasn't a superhero, that I was tired too, that I needed to be loved like Eric was. But looking into my father's eyes, I saw a man fighting his own body, and I knew he wasn't lying. He was truly scared. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street. Red maple leaves fell gently as if time was slipping away too quickly. "I'll help arrange for Dad to see the best doctors," I said, my voice hoarse. "I'll make sure he's taken care of, but I'm not paying for it. You need to figure it out or ask Eric. I've done enough." My mother looked at me, her eyes shattering. "Edward, we don't have the money," she said, her voice nearly desperate. "The house. We already mortgaged part of it to help Eric before. If we do it again, we'll lose everything." I turned back, meeting her gaze. "Then let Eric sell his apartment. Let him get a job or at least take responsibility for once in his life. I'm not this family's bank." The air in the room was so heavy I could barely breathe. My father took my mother's hand as if to steady her. "Thank you for being honest, Edward," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "We'll find a way. You don't have to do anything more." But as they stood to leave, I saw my mother stumble, leaning on my father. They looked like two faded shadows swept away by their own storm. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind swirling with unanswered questions. Had I done the right thing by refusing? Or was I too selfish, too rigid? I thought of my father, the times he taught me to ride a bike, the way he laughed heartily when I shared stories from medical school. I thought of my mother always trying to hold the family together, even if in the wrong ways. And I thought of Eric, who I knew would never show up when the family needed him. The weeks following the hospital visit dragged on, and I tried to keep myself busy, burying myself in work at the clinic. But no matter how hard I tried, the image of my father, his pale face, his frail, trembling hands, haunted me. I kept questioning whether I was doing the right thing by keeping my distance from the family. The resolute declaration I made at that dinner, that I wouldn't pay another cent, that I was leaving it to Eric to care for our parents, now felt like a bitter oath, both liberating and imprisoning. I hadn't seen my parents since the tense conversation at the clinic, but I quietly kept tabs on them. I called Dr. Carter, who was overseeing my father's treatment, for updates. "Henry started dialysis last week," Carter said over the phone, his tone calm but tinged with concern. 3 times a week, 4 hours each session. He's tolerating it well, but his body is weakening quickly. Edward, you know dialysis isn't a long-term solution." I nodded, though he couldn't see me, and thanked him before hanging up. I didn't ask about the costs, but I knew. Each dialysis session costs around $500, not including medications and other expenses. With my father's insurance, they might get partial coverage, but the rest, thousands of dollars a month, was a burden my parents couldn't possibly bear. I also called an old family friend, Linda, their neighbor, to check in. "Your parents look exhausted, Edward," she said, her voice full of worry. "Your mom's been out in the garden lately, but not to plant flowers. She just sits there, staring into the distance. Your dad barely leaves his armchair except for dialysis days. They don't say much, but I know they're struggling." My heart sank as I listened, but I only thanked her and promised to call again. I didn't want to get involved, Didn't want to be pulled back into the cycle of responsibility I'd fought to escape. As for Eric, I wasn't surprised to hear he was doing nothing. Through sporadic texts from my mother, I learned he was still living in his rundown apartment in downtown Chicago, still hanging out at bars, still chasing million-dollar business ideas that never materialized. Once my mother texted that Eric had promised to find a job to help them, but days later he vanished again, leaving behind a new debt for my parents to deal with. I didn't call or text Eric. I knew if I confronted him, I wouldn't be able to stop myself from yelling, or worse, punching him. One afternoon, I decided to drive by my parents' house unannounced. I didn't plan to go inside, just wanted to see from a distance as a way to reassure myself they were okay, or at least still trying. As I parked at the end of the street, I saw my father sitting in his armchair on the porch, a thin blanket draped over his lap. He was so gaunt I barely recognized him. His cheeks hollow, his eyes sunken, his skin ashen, as if his vitality had been drained. My mother was watering plants, but her movements were slow, as if lifting the watering can was a monumental effort. I gripped the steering wheel, my heart pounding. I wanted to get out, to hug them, to tell them everything would be okay. But then I remembered the years of being overlooked, the times my parents chose Eric over me and I drove away. That image seared into my mind. The nights that followed brought strange dreams. In one, I saw my father lying in a hospital bed, tubes attached to him, but as I approached, he vanished, leaving only an empty chair. In another, I stood at the family dinner table, shouting at my parents and Eric, but no one could hear me. I woke up drenched in sweat, realizing that no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't completely sever the ties binding me to my family. I was angry at them, angry at the unfairness, but I also loved them. And that love was like a sharp blade, cutting into me daily. One day I got a call from Dr. Carter. "Edward, I need to talk to you about your father," he said, his tone graver than usual. "He missed a dialysis session because he was too weak to make it to the hospital. His condition is deteriorating rapidly. If this continues, you know what could happen." I nodded, though we were only on the phone, and felt my throat tighten. I knew he was right. End-stage renal failure doesn't forgive mistakes. If my father didn't stick to dialysis, toxins would build up in his blood, and he could slip into a coma, or worse. I started to wonder if I was being too harsh. I was a doctor, I had knowledge, connections with colleagues, and could help my parents find ways to reduce costs or access medical assistance programs. But every time I thought about reaching out, I remembered Eric, remembered how my parents always put him first. I wondered, if I helped, would anything change? Would they realize their mistakes, or would they keep leaning on me while Eric continued his irresponsible life? One evening, I was sitting in my living room flipping through a medical journal without really reading, when my phone buzzed. It was my mother. I hesitated, my finger hovering over the answer button, but then I picked up. "Edward," her voice trembled, almost breaking. "Your father just collapsed at home. We're at the hospital, please come. I don't know what to do anymore." My heart stopped. I gripped the phone, my mind blank. I knew I couldn't turn my back forever. I stood up, grabbed my car keys, and rushed out the door, unsure if I was racing to save my father or to confront myself. My car sped through the dark streets of Chicago, the streetlights casting faint blurred streaks across the windshield like smudged ink. My mother's message, "Your father just collapsed at home. We're at the hospital," echoed in my mind, each word cutting like a knife. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to stay calm, but my heart pounded as if it might burst through my chest. I didn't know if I was racing to the hospital for my father, for my mother, or for myself, to confront the guilt gnawing at me since the day I declared, "I'm done." One thing I knew for certain, I couldn't let my father die, not when I still had the power to do something. Chicago Medical Center loomed ahead, a glowing concrete block under harsh neon lights. I parked hastily, nearly forgetting to lock the car, and ran straight to the emergency department. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic, the beeping of machines, and the hurried footsteps of nurses. I found my mother in the waiting room, hunched over in a plastic chair, her hands covering her face, her shoulders trembling with sobs. When she looked up and saw me, her red-rimmed eyes flickered with a glimmer of hope. "Edward, you're here," she whispered, standing to embrace me. I stood still, letting her hold me, but my body was rigid, as if resisting my own emotions. "Where's Dad?" I asked, my voice hoarse. She pointed toward the hallway leading to the intensive care unit. "The doctors are checking on him. They said he's severely anemic and his kidneys aren't responding well to dialysis anymore." She paused, tears spilling over again. "Edward, I'm sorry. I know you're angry with us, but I don't know what to do. We don't have money, no one to rely on." Eric didn't come. At the mention of Eric's name, a surge of anger flared within me like a wildfire. "Where is Eric?" I asked, my voice icy. My mother shook her head, her voice choked. "I called him, but he didn't answer. I don't know where he is." I clenched my jaw, trying not to let the anger overtake me, but the image of Eric, his carefree grin, his knack for dodging responsibility, flashed vividly in my mind. I turned away, not wanting my mother to see the resentment in my eyes. Dr. Carter appeared, his calm demeanor underscored by a look of concern. "Edward," he said, placing a hand on my shoulder, "your father's condition is critical. He's weakened from poor health, not tolerating dialysis well, and this collapse was due to a sudden drop in blood pressure. We've stabilized him, but dialysis is no longer a viable option. A kidney transplant is the only way to extend his life." He paused, studying me as if weighing whether to continue. "But you know finding a compatible donor isn't easy, and the cost, it could reach $300,000, not including post-surgery medications." I nodded, my mind reeling. As a doctor, I understood the kidney transplant process. It required a donor with matching blood type and tissue, a complex surgery, and years of immunosuppressive drugs costing tens of thousands annually. I looked at my mother, her hand gripping mine, her eyes pleading. "Edward, you can do something, can't you? You're a doctor, you know how—" Her voice trailed off, as if clinging to a final thread of hope. I wanted to say I wasn't a miracle worker, that I couldn't make everything right just because I was a doctor. But looking at her, then down the hallway toward my father's room, I knew I couldn't turn away, not this time. "I'll get tested to see if I'm a match to donate a kidney," I said, my voice low. My mother's eyes widened as if she couldn't believe it. "Edward, you'd really do that?" I nodded, though a storm raged inside me. "But I'm telling you now, I won't cover the costs. You and Eric need to figure that out." My mother nodded frantically, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you, Edward. I'll find a way, I promise." But I knew she had no way. The house was already partially mortgaged, their savings nearly depleted, and Eric, the one they always protected, was somewhere out there, probably in a bar, oblivious to the family's crisis. In the days that followed, I entered a new routine, undergoing tests to determine if I was a suitable kidney donor. I had blood tests, tissue typing, and a CT scan to assess my overall health. Dr. Carter personally oversaw the process, and he didn't hide his surprise when I told him I wanted to donate. "Edward, are you sure?" he asked, his voice full of concern. "This isn't a simple decision. You're young, with your whole life ahead of you." I only nodded, not wanting to explain. How could I say I was torn between my love for my father and the pain of how my family had treated me? The test results showed I was a match. My blood type aligned with my father's, and our tissue markers were compatible. When I got the news, I sat alone in my office, staring out the window. The maple leaves outside had nearly all fallen, leaving bare branches against a gray sky. I thought of my father, the days he taught me to play baseball, the way he laughed heartily when I shared stories from medical school. I thought of my mother, always trying to hold the family together, even if in the wrong ways. And I thought of Eric, who I knew would never change. I wondered if my decision to donate was for my father or to prove I was different from Eric, that I was the better son. I called my mother and told her about the test results. "I'll donate the kidney," I said, my voice calm but firm. But as I said, I won't cover the surgery or medication costs. You and Eric need to figure that out." She was silent for a long moment, then whispered, "I understand, Edward. I'll try." But I heard the desperation in her voice, and I knew her trying would lead nowhere. The night before the surgery was scheduled, I sat in my apartment holding a cold cup of coffee. I thought about what lay ahead: an hours-long operation, a painful recovery, and the slight but real risk that my body might never be the same. I wasn't afraid of the pain or the risks. What I feared was that, after all this, my family wouldn't change. My parents would continue to coddle Eric, and I'd be overlooked again. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Eric, the first in weeks. "Bro, I heard you're donating a kidney to Dad. Thank you. I'll try to help Mom and Dad." I stared at the screen, feeling a mix of anger and disappointment. Try to help. Eric's familiar refrain, always promising but never delivering. I didn't reply, just set the phone down and closed my eyes. I knew that whether the surgery succeeded or not, I was stepping into a new chapter of my family's story, one I wasn't sure I could endure. The day of the surgery arrived faster than I expected. I woke at dawn, the faint light filtering through the apartment curtains, casting weak streaks across the wooden floor. I sat on the edge of the bed, clutching a cold cup of coffee, trying to take deep breaths to dispel the heaviness in my chest. Today, I would donate a kidney to save my father. That decision, though weighed 100 times, still made me tremble. Not out of fear of pain or risk. I'm a doctor. I know the procedure. But because I feared that, after all this, my family wouldn't change. I feared I'd fall back into the cycle of unfairness, where I sacrificed while Eric was coddled. Chicago Medical Center glowed under harsh neon lights, the atmosphere so familiar it felt almost stifling. I walked into the surgical wing where my father was already prepared. He lay on the bed, tubes attached to him, his face pale but his eyes lighting up when he saw me. "Edward," he whispered, his voice weak but filled with emotion. "Thank you." I only nodded, not daring to meet his gaze for long, afraid I'd lose my composure. My mother stood beside him, holding his hand, tears streaming down her cheeks. She didn't speak, but her eyes seemed to convey 1,000 apologies. I asked her quietly, "Have you sorted out the costs?" She blinked, as if the question startled her. I sold all my jewelry and we took out another loan from the bank using the house as collateral," she said, her voice trembling. "Linda helped with a little, and we got some support from a charity for post-surgery medications." I nodded, not pressing further. I knew that loan would burden them for years, and the charity was only a temporary fix. But I also knew they'd tried for the first time without relying entirely on me. That, however small, was a change. Dr. Carter, overseeing the surgery, patted my shoulder before I entered the operating room. "You're a remarkable son, Edward," he said warmly. I wanted to say I didn't feel like one, that I was only doing this because I had no other choice, but I just nodded and walked on. As the operating room doors closed, I shut my eyes, letting the beeping machines and the smell of antiseptic pull me into another world where I was just a patient, not a doctor, not a son torn between love and resentment. The surgery lasted 5 hours. I woke in the recovery room, a dull pain throbbing in my abdomen as if a piece of me had been carved out. The nurse checked my vitals, saying everything was stable, that my father's surgery had also gone well. I nodded, managing a weak smile, but inside I felt an emptiness. I didn't know what I'd expected, a thank you from my parents, a change from Eric, or just the fairness I'd craved my whole life. In the weeks following the surgery, I recovered slowly but steadily. I took leave from the clinic, spending my days on the sofa, reading or simply staring out the window. My mother called daily, updating me on my father's condition. "He's doing better," she said, her voice lighter than before. "He started eating again, and the doctor says the new kidney is functioning well." I listened but asked little. I didn't want to know if they'd found a way to cover the costs, afraid the answer would drag me back into the cycle of responsibility. Eric showed up once, a week after the surgery. He came to my apartment holding a cheap bouquet of flowers and a forced smile. "Bro, I'm grateful," he said hesitantly. "I know I've been awful, but I'll try to change." I looked at him, his messy hair, his crumpled t-shirt, and knew his words carried no weight. Eric always tried, but his efforts never lasted more than a few days. I nodded and said, "Oh, fine, Eric. Do it, don't just say it." He left, and I knew it was likely the last I'd see of him for a long while. A month later, I returned to the clinic, resuming my familiar routine. My parents invited me to dinner, a meal my mother said was to thank me. I hesitated but went. The house was the same, with its faded white picket fence and garden full of chrysanthemums. My father sat at the table looking much healthier, though still thin. My mother bustled in the kitchen preparing roast beef and mashed potatoes as if trying to recreate simpler days. But Eric wasn't there. "He's busy," my mother said, her voice faltering, and I didn't ask further. The meal passed in awkward silence. My father finally spoke, his voice low but sincere. "Edward, we owe you so much. Not just for the kidney, but for everything you've done. We were wrong to be unfair to you." My mother nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry, Edward. I didn't realize how much we hurt you." I looked at them, wanting to believe their apology would change everything. But deep down, I knew words couldn't erase the years I'd been overlooked, the times I'd carried the weight of Eric's irresponsibility. I nodded and said, "I understand, but from now on I want to live for myself." They fell silent, and I knew they understood I wasn't just talking about money or responsibility, but about the distance I needed to protect myself. I left their house, driving through familiar roads, feeling both relieved and empty. My relationship with my family remained strained, like a rope pulled too tight, ready to snap at any moment. My parents were beginning to see their mistakes, but I wasn't sure if they'd truly change. Eric was still Eric, a fleeting shadow, always promising but never delivering. As for me, I learned to set boundaries, to love my family without letting them define me. Our story didn't end with a tearful reunion or a perfect resolution. It ended with a truth. Families aren't always fair, and love isn't always enough to heal every wound. But I chose to donate my kidney, not to prove I was better than Eric, but because I wanted my father to live, and because I wanted to live with myself without regret. I moved forward, focusing on my work, my patience, and the life I was building. Perhaps one day my family would find a way to heal, but that's a story for the future, not for today.